Hello and welcome to today's episode of Consciousness Central, coming to you from the Tour de Science of Consciousness conference here at the University of Helsinki in Finland. My next guest is Harold Atmansbacher. Harold is a physicist. He's a senior fellow at the Collegium Helveticum in Zurich. You work very much in the field of consciousness and physics and quantum physics. Can you just give us a quick outline of your area of interest at the moment?
In the moment, yeah. So I think, in particular with respect to the conference here, I would focus on two things. One of them is not a new, but an area of philosophical thinking which attracts increasing interest since maybe 2, 3, 4 years. Dual aspect monism. That's something which Dave Chalmers has brought up years and years and years ago, but there's really quite a kind of drive into it right now. And as a consequence of this, we are doing, and I can explain what the consequence really is, we are trying to model cognitive processes, mental processes, with tools that we export from quantum mechanics without using the physics. Just the mathematics of quantum theory is becoming applied to mental processes, mental activity. And there are many interesting examples already, and that's what I will be talking about on Thursday.
So for somebody who's perhaps just coming to consciousness, relatively recently, what's the best way to understand the relationship between quantum physics and consciousness? Because for some people they might say, well, this is physics on the one side. How on earth can that possibly apply? How would you?
So in other words, the question is something like, what are the ways in which quantum theory can be applied at all when you're interested in consciousness? And I would say there are essentially 3 ways in which this can be done. The first way is what Stuart, Roger Penrose, Henry Stapp, Giuseppe Vitiello and others do, which is to take quantum physics as it is, as a physical discipline, and try to apply it to brain activity, to brain structures and brain activity. And then, of course, the question that remains open is how brain activity is correlated with conscious activity. It's essentially an open question when you go that way. Another way is, and that's what I was alluding to before, you can try and look at quantum theory, strip away all the physics from it, just keep the mathematical apparatus and use that to apply cognitive and mental processes directly without the detour over the brain. And I mean, we might be able to talk about this in more detail about certain examples in which this has turned out fruitful. And that, before you keep asking, there's one third way, and that's a little more abstract, I think, approach, which plays a role in dual aspect monism. And the work that Basil Hiley presented yesterday, that fits exactly into that domain. I don't know whether you have
yes,
Basil
we talked to Basil a little bit earlier.
Okay, so then
yeah, he described some of his work. Yeah.
So that's the dual aspect monism.
Right. Okay. So let me just make sure we're kind of keeping it clear. When you say to take the theory of quantum physics but remove the physics and use the mathematics, what is it that's sort of, what information or what is being expressed in mathematics that can sort of relate to consciousness? How can we make that?
I know.
Join those two together.
This is exactly the question.
Yeah.
And then you can talk about different focal areas in the mathematics of quantum theory. One of them is, I think this is a very basic mathematical point, is that you are dealing with properties of a system that are non-commutative. What does that mean? We are used from school when we calculate with numbers, natural numbers or real numbers or whatever, then these number systems are defined by the rule of commutativity. So, which means that when you multiply A with B and then multiply B with A, the result is the same. That's commutativity. So the fascinating new thing which happened in the 1920s with quantum mechanics was that people realized that in the microscopic and the subatomic domain, the rule of commutativity does not hold anymore. Which means A times B is not the same as B times A. So if you measure B first and then A, the result will be different than if you reverse the order. Sequence effects. That's what's one of the most important consequences. Uncertainty relations, many other things. But I think the most intuitively intelligible example is sequence effects. And now when we go to consciousness, you will immediately see how that applies. Because when I ask you a question, then you give me an answer, but at the same moment, and that's something that we borrow from quantum theory, your mental state will be changed by the output that you produce. So the second question is already a question on a changed state. And then you give the output. Now, if I ask you the second question first, then your mental state is again changed, so you will give the output to the second question based on another state. And so the change of the sequence will give rise to different answers, although the questions themselves are the same. And that's non-commutative algebras of operators, we call them. It's a mathematically abstract thing, but I think this one simple example shows you and shows everybody that I mean, the mathematical structure can be applied in a very down-to-earth way. Questionnaire studies, in the study of surveys and questionnaires, people in psychology know for decades that these sequence effects happen, and they don't really know where they come from, so they can't really handle them. So, but what they usually do is they try to design the questionnaires in such a way that the critical questions which influence one another are not coming right next to each other. So they are separated by other more neutral questions in between, so to avoid the question order effects. Well, of course we can learn a lot about mental activity when we do not avoid the effects, but just, provoke them in a way. That's what we're doing.
Wow, that's quite esoteric, shall we say? And in your presentation here, is this what you're presenting here this week?
Yeah, this will be one of the exams. I mean, I have this plenary session on Thursday morning, very early in the morning, 8:30, so only for the hardcore people. And so now what I will do is I will give a brief introduction so that everybody gets the kind of basic background, and then I will discuss essentially two concrete examples, one of them the order effects, and the other one will be about bistable perception. It's also a kind of decision process. I mean, when you answer questions in surveys, this is a kind of decision process. In bistable perception, we are also looking at a decision process, but not an intentional decision process, but a spontaneous decision. Because when you look at a stimulus which is ambiguous, like the Necker cube, then your mental state flip-flops between the two possible percepts that you can have spontaneously. And this is another example which we tried to model in terms of this quantum apparatus, again with two non-commutative dynamics, and we get very interesting results from that too, which have been bistable perception is an example from psychophysics. And psychophysics is a discipline where you're not relying on oral output or written output by a subject. You're just measuring quantities like reaction times and stuff like that. So some people might say this is the most objective that you can get in psychology. And so what we could do, from the model that we developed, we can make predictions. Quantitative predictions about relations between different time scales that are involved in these processes. And then the lucky circumstance was that when we started this issue, one of my collaborators, Jürgen Kornmeier, he had a lab in the university clinic, and we could just, we calculated stuff at one day, and the next day he could go to his lab and check it with subjects, So that was a very fruitful collaboration. And quite a few of the predictions that we were able to make could immediately be tested and confirm the model also.
Wow, this is exciting stuff.
Yeah.
So let's just try to understand a little bit how this fits into the bigger debate in consciousness, because it's sort of raging all around us and it keeps cropping up at this conference. Would you describe the area that you're looking at as sort of quote-unquote easy problem stuff or more hard problem stuff?
No, I would say the hard problem really is approach number 3, which I mentioned in the beginning. Because when you talk about the hard problem, then you talk about worldviews. You talk about, are you a physicalist, are you a reductive physicalist, are you an idealist? And the approach which I mentioned before was just this kind of dual aspect thing, where you cannot be a physicalist and you cannot be an idealist, because both the physical and the mental are considered as nothing else than aspects, or if you want, manifestations of a kind of real reality which is lurking in the background, if you want, right? And so the hard problem in some sense gets deflated, because it's not about two different substances, which might be the mental and the physical, but it's about the relation between two different aspects, two different projections, if you want, of some underlying reality, which is neither mental nor physical. Of course, then the big question is, what is it?
Right.
And we haven't solved that so far,
right,
of course.
Right. So this is great stuff. In a way, this is Bohmian. You could say that's the implicate order. You might say, and some physicists use this term, the unified field. Perhaps in Vedanta, it might be Brahman. It's the deeper underlying reality from which everything else emerges. Is that, can we use those terms? Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I think this is also, there's in one route which I have been studying a lot is the Pauli-Jung approach by Wolfgang Pauli and Siggy Jung. This very unique collaboration over 3 decades in the middle of the last century. They called it the unus mundus, the one world, the undivided world, but undivided also comes up in the implicate order, of course. So in this neutral background reality, we have something which is not distinguished yet into the mental and the physical. And as you said, I mean, all your examples apply, I think, the different ways to go.
So, I mean, we tentatively make these steps because it's always risky, particularly in a conference called the Science of Consciousness. But, that at this point, we're stepping into a realm which is essentially, dare we say, spiritual, or experiential, or, it's pure awareness, something like that.
At least it's metaphysical.
Metaphysical.
The first, the mildest qualification that you can make is it's metaphysical. So we have a kind of renaissance of metaphysics, and we see that in consciousness studies. Yeah. And then, of course, if it's only metaphysical, then, of course, experiential access would be blocked, because the metaphysical is just that domain which gives us the conditions for the possibility of experience, but not experience itself, as Kant would have said, the conditions for the possibility of it. And then the next question is, are there possibilities to dig into this kind of thing and here and there get glimpses of pieces of experiences or something?
Excellent. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us today, Harold, and good luck with everything you're up to. Hopefully we'll see you in a future edition of Consciousness Central. Thank you very much. That's Harold Atmanspacher. So let's go and join Cameron Keyes at today's poster session.
Tell us who you are and one of the key ideas from your poster.
Okay. My name's John Grandy, and I am I proposed the original idea of DNA consciousness, but I have supported it with a lot of different things, with proving the fact that it's an intentional autopoietic system. So I provided a bunch of gene families that give it a biology of intentionality. Also, it can be objectified on 3 dynamic levels: gene interactions between other nuclear genomes like mitochondria and viruses, and also interactions between DNA and the external environment. Now, DNA also has the ability to give rise to higher degrees of consciousness. In the human brain, I've broken this down into 3 neurogenetic phases. You have genes that are responsible for the emergence of the neuron-based consciousness, so it lays down the machinery, the hardware that's going to make that happen. And then in the second neurogenetic phase, it runs in tandem with the neurons that run in tandem with the consciousness. So the neurons don't run on autopilot. They need the genome running actively in tandem.
Okay.
The third neurogenetic phase is that the neurons break down later in life. It happens to everybody. You'll see it in dementia, mild cognitive impairment. But with diseases like Alzheimer's, you can actually identify genes that accelerate that breakdown of human consciousness.
So are humans on their way to becoming more conscious, based on DNA, generation after generation?
So that was my poster presentation last year in Tucson, where I actually talked with genetic engineering, especially with some of the new treatments they're working on for Alzheimer's. Almost the cure kind of implies enhancement of the nervous system. So I did talk about how that can translate into transhumanism and posthumanism.
My name is Armando Garcia, and my poster is about the duality of the self. And to summarize this, it's easier if I ask you. So, are you aware of your breathing right now?
What? Now that you mention it, yes.
Right? And so that's it. That's what the poster is about. So, before you were what I call the automatic self. You're responding to stimuli. As soon as I said, "Are you aware of your breathing?" you switched and you are inside your body. You feel it. You feel that you're inside your body, and so you feel that you're in control. So if that happens, then you may become your ideal self.
My name is Cecilia Moon, and the main idea of my poster is basically on how implicit biases interact with our decision-making processes and emotions, and how that kind of phenomenon affects our ways of making policy, deciding moral judgments, and other kinds of choices.
So what kinds of implicit biases are we talking about?
So I have actually a list of examples of various implicit biases. You can have gender biases against genders, against races, against disabilities. So it kind of draws on just a broad range of biases.
Is there anyone in the world that is free of implicit biases?
I would say probably not, right? However, I think that simply because implicit biases is a fact of the world, right? It doesn't mean that we can't become cognizant of the fact that we have implicit biases and then work towards dismantling the way they work problematically. So it could be the case that implicit biases actually are helpful at times, right? So you can have good stereotypes, right? So when I go to the doctor, right, I assume because my doctor is a doctor that I could trust her advice on whatever medical advice she gives me, right? I'm relying on some kind of bias about, knowledge, right? Epistemic privilege or knowledge, whatever, that my doctor has. That's a good bias, I would say, right? Because it works towards my benefit.
Most of the time.
Right. But the problem is not those kinds of problematic or unproblematic biases, right? It's the problematic ones that kind of lead us to do not very great things to other people.
Yeah, we all observe 20th century history and
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Not just 20th century history, right?
Yeah, right.
Go back even further.
Tell us what your name is and tell us the main idea from your poster.
P. Sriramamurthy from Dayalbag Educational Institute. And I try to show the ontology. What is the primary substance from which creation has come? That is Chaitanya consciousness.
What is that primary substance?
Consciousness. Pure consciousness. And from that consciousness, mind came, body also came, the physical world also came.
Mind came first?
Mind came first, and then universal mind, and physical world. And in the body, the spirit, mind, and the body. This I have shown here. And God has provided the channels for us to go to the highest region. In the spinal cord and also in the brain. In the grey matter of the brain and the white matter of the brain.
So we can educate ourselves about how to get back to the source of creation.
We can, the mental current, in the outside world we know by attention currents and also the sense organs. And with the spirit.
So the sense organs are a vehicle back to creation.
They help us to know the outside world only. Inside world they cannot help. With mind we can understand mental things, but with the spirit we can understand the God.
So my name is Wolfgang Lukas. I'm from Austria. Mainly occupied with particle physics. I'm doing my particle physics PhD. My poster is not about particle physics at all.
Okay.
I'm exploring connections between neurophenomenology, Buddhism, and general semantics. Some of these connections have already been or are being explored. The part that would be new here is general semantics. One way to look at it, which is the flow of the poster, you could say, is that I look at the question, can we actually, or should we take into account more than just the third-person perspective as we try to do? And if you assume that if you think it's reasonable to assume that you need to actually also take into account the first-person perspective, and maybe you actually want to do that because it could help you with your research. The question is, how do you do that?
And so the answer is through general semantics, orders of abstraction, and all of these kind of...
I think that is something that could be helpful in the way that it's already being done as at least one way to start doing it.
My name is Luis Javier from Mexico. One of the main ideas of this, we have like humans, the affective experience of cinema, of going to the cinema with people, is not the same as watching movies alone. So why is this happening? So the first thing that will happen is that we gather with people, we feel emotionally aroused to being with people, but is there something else? And it could be, perhaps it could be, as our hypothesis, that watching the same source of light could entangle the people's minds with quantum mechanics. So they are entangled, they start to work alike with thanks to the light and thanks to the stimuli besides what they are seeing. So they are more scared because if it's a scary movie, they get scared more if they see the same source of light at the same time, or if they not. Here they see the same source of light, and here they don't. So we propose, we haven't done yet, this is a proposal to make this experiment to know if this is real, if the quantum mechanics in the cinema has something to do with the affective experience.
Welcome back, and our next guest is Giuseppe Vitiello. He is a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Salerno in Italy. Welcome, Giuseppe. I should also mention that Giuseppe has been coming to Order Science of Consciousness conference now for, 20 years or thereabouts, close to 20 years.
Yes, we're missing just some of them.
Okay, you've missed one or two here and there, but pretty much you've been coming along. So tell me a little bit, that shows a great dedication on your part as a theoretical physicist to this idea of consciousness. Can you kind of help me understand where you're coming from? How does physics and consciousness, how does it relate?
Yeah, you see, everything happens by chance, usually. That is the main rule I follow. So it was by chance that I was studying with a Japanese professor who by chance wrote a paper on the brain, proposing to treat the brain as a piece of matter, as any other piece of matter. His name was Hiromi Umezawa. He has been was in Naples for 3 years. And then I went to study in the States, following him when he went to the States. So in a natural way, I had to read this paper, because you read the paper of your supervisor, of course. And then I got captured by such a problem. And just by chance, it happened to me to consider one aspect which was not considered in the paper by Umezawa, and other Umezawa and Takahashi also, following that first paper, which was the fact that brain is an open system. You cannot close a brain. You cannot close inside someone and say goodbye and you throw away the key. You would like to do that sometime, but you cannot do. If you do it, you kill that person. And so this is very interesting, because in physics, when you have to study an open system, you have to consider also the environment in which the system is. So, just playing around with mathematics, you discover that you can describe the environment as the double of your original system. It's like me talking with you and you talking with me. At this moment, you are my double. because you are the one I see from my point of view. So you are just my image, and you take what I give to you, and vice versa. So this is like being in a mirror, but it's a time mirror, because in-out must be exchanged. Out from me is in for you, so you have to reverse the sign of the arrow. So it's like a mirror. It happened in a conference. It was not at one of the Tucson conference, but another one in Carbondale, I think. It happened to me to say that in this dialogue between ourselves and the double, our own double, each one of us has a double, because we have our vision of the world that is our double, and we talk with this double in the sense that we have a dialogue. We sometimes feel not so happy with the world around us. We want to change it. The world changes us. So it's, not easy sometimes dialogue. And I said in this dialogue there is the act of consciousness. The people, the audience, some of them wanted to kill me. Because normally consciousness is centered on me, cogito ergo sum. No, consciousness is something which is spread out. You belong to my consciousness at this moment, I belong to yours.
So that sort of steps out from this sort of, as you say, the Cartesian view, which is kind of a dualistic view in a sense,
Yeah.
that, and the modern version of that, I suppose, it would be reductionism, some kind of reductionism, a brain. Consciousness is the epiphenomenon of the brain, and but we don't know how that happens.
No,
it's a mystery.
Absolutely.
So that whole paradigm, you basically are rejecting that, and you're saying that consciousness has another property, another kind of way of being described.
Yeah.
So where do you go with that? Are you saying, go ahead.
Always by chance, but also because I'm a little bit lucky, let's say what it is. I met Walter Freeman, which is here. And when I met him, you see, I'm a physicist and worse, a theoretical physicist. So in physics, you need a lab to check your ideas. Otherwise, you do philosophy or at most mathematics. So I needed an experimentalist. So when I met Walter Freeman, the great Freeman, I told him, you are my experimentalist. Of course, he was laughing at me because I was daring too much the authority he has, and he's one of the father of modern neuroscience, of course. So he gave to me a lot, because he gave to me the support of his experiments. And we are still collaborating. Just 2 days ago, Physics Letter Say, which is not at all a bad journal, accepted our last paper.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you.
Always good.
Very good, we enjoy. You see, where I go? Well, the first thing is that I'm happy. I've been at a conference on aesthetics, and I say that the true dimension of the brain is the aesthetic experience. Aesthetic experience means to be in harmony with the world. That harmony which is never satisfied completely, but that is good because it's dynamical. It's never boring harmony, once forever. Never once forever. Nothing once forever. But every time in a dynamical dialogue, you find to fit yourself in the world and to see the world as fitting with you. And this, according to Fabrizio Desideri, which is he is a colleague of us in Florence, he's professor of aesthetics. He said that the aesthetic experience has not much to do with arts in general. That is a special one, but is in general a dimension, a human dimension. And we agree on coming from different sides, and this is also beautiful, fitting the word, I mean, just harmony. And then, since dialogue, so consciousness, is never, consciousness comes to us. not we to consciousness. I mean, we do not control our acts of consciousness. We are conscious, that's it, finished. Now, not yesterday or tomorrow, now, only in the present. So consciousness is characterized by the astonishment. The Italian word is stupore. It's always a surprise. It's always a new vision. It's the surprise of the photographer when shots a picture and stops the time. That is magic. So this is another aspect. It's a beautiful recovery of some great achievement of the magic thought, of the medieval magic thought with modern rational thought. So it's a beautiful adventure. Of course, you have to fight a little bit because you find other models around on the street, but it doesn't matter. I mean, so this is all about astonishment, novelty.
Can I invite you to, if you wish to, if you have a website or a book or something, people can, if they're interested to learn more about what you're doing, where would they go?
You see, yes, but I do not have any. My website was made by one student. Now she's married with 3. I do not know the keyword to enter.
No, not to worry. Not to worry.
But if somebody wants to write to me, I'm always available.
All right, Giuseppe, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And so it's time once again to have a check-in to find out what's been going on at the plenaries. And once again, here's Cameron Keyes. Cameron, what's been going on?
So we had 3 plenary talks today and 1 keynote speech. First plenary talk was by J Lynn. He's a professional clinical psychologist, but he studies hypnosis. He's been doing it for 35 years, very prominent doctor, and so he told us about the developments that he's had over the last 3 decades. So specifically, he spoke about the popular perceptions of hypnosis. We think of hypnosis typically as a trance state, and it's very diffuse in our culture as opposed to other cultures where hypnosis is often associated with black magic, and we tend to think of it here as a sort of side or circus kind of phenomenon. And so he went into the history of the origins of hypnosis and mesmerism and some of the early claims that were made that it would, it was associated in the early 1900s, for example, with really extraordinary claims of mystical healing and supernormal powers. But then over time, there's been a lot of research done on exactly how hypnosis works. And so he was trying to provide a very realistic conception of it. And it turns out that it isn't necessarily a trance state, according to him. It's more of an active imagination that it takes from certain people. And some people are more susceptible to hypnosis than others, but it really is a sort of social process. And so he went through, for example, that hypnosis can be induced by certain sets of persuasive words and exchanges from the hypnotherapist. But if you have an independent observer that goes into this situation and asks the subjects not to be hypnotized, whatever the hypnotist says to you, don't listen to him. Well, then those same subjects become much less susceptible. And so there's something about social interactions that really mediates what hypnosis achieves. And so he set forth, what a lot of the reasons good reasons we have to be skeptical about hypnosis, but some really interesting things that call for more research. The second plenary talk today was by Anton Revensuo. He studies dreaming and consciousness. And so he told us about the last 60 years of empirical research about dreams. And he talked about how in the first 50 years of research in dreams, there were 3 main research pathways, and none of them really agreed on a basic definition of what dreaming is, which is strange. You'd think after 50 years, it's kind of like consciousness, where we can't quite figure out what the definition is. Dreaming's a little bit similar. And so there was a neurophysiological way to study dreams. There was a cognitive way to study dreams, that it's more just about cognitive processing, and an emotional interpretation of dreams that was more based in a clinical psychological setting. But so he tries to unify these things and says that if we think of dreaming as the simulation of a credible world inside of our own minds, that this can be a conceptual unification of all of these previous approaches. So he told us about the fruitfulness of thinking about dreaming as a world simulation. And he talked about what evolutionary function this might have performed. So he talked about research in embryology. In the early days, in the first months that a baby is being born and developed in the womb, there are some periods where for almost 24 hours a day they're in REM sleep. And so he thinks that it's possible that when we grow up later, that these periods of life where we simulate worlds in our dreams can serve a deep evolutionary function. And he also talked about how in paraplegics, for example, when they dream, they often have all of their limbs. And why is it that, for example, people that are deaf and mute talk in their dreams? There's some deep underlying capacity there for us to dream and simulate these worlds. Similarly, the next speaker, Jennifer Wint, she talked about dreaming, but she focused specifically on how we produce a self inside of the dreams. She gave some similar examples of cases where, like in the case of the paraplegic, they're able to function with their limb, they have less pain inside of their dreams, and yet they're simulating their body and a sense of space inside the dream. And so she's trying to figure out exactly what are the basic features of the dreaming self, and why is it that we waste all of this energy or use all of this energy to produce these elaborate dreams. So she thinks that there's some fundamental ability that we go offline, we sort of turn the machinery of the body off, and then we simulate the self, and we have dream characters, and that this can fulfill some role in evaluating how the self functions as a social being. And so the final speaker, this was the keynote speech, was Jean-Pierre Changeau. He studies molecular biology, but he's trying to infuse molecular biology with developmental psychology. So from early ages, children as they grow, he wants to build a sort of large neuroscientific theory that accounts for previous, the sort of dominant theories of the neuronal workspace, which, we take in sensory perceptions and we make simulations of the world even when we're awake, he's saying. And then somehow those things are integrated with our social learning and our cultural learning. And so he called for a more comprehensive theory that takes into account not just the neuroscientific data as we would normally think of it, but also this developmental psychology and these deeper developmental frameworks. He finished his talk by talking about pharmacology, how we might diagnose genetic disorders in a way that targets the conscious processing. So for example, in autism, he spoke about how some researchers into autism have found something like 200 different genes that seem to be somehow mediating this effect or predisposing certain people to the condition. And so by targeting those specific genes and seeing how they're affected, how the effects on consciousness could be an intervention into some of these conditions. So all in all, a day full of jam-packed with ideas and focused on hypnotherapy, dreaming, and then this global neuronal workspace.
Wow, that's a fantastic roundup again, Cameron. It does make you wonder perhaps what the developing fetus could be dreaming about at all these hours of REM sleep. I wonder, we'll never know that, but it's an amazing thought. That,
someone actually had asked this question in the question and answer period, and so it is an open question. Do they dream of sheep? Do they dream of geometric patterns? Is there some genetic component to being able to produce these things? That sounds like a really good future for research.
And interesting to also tap into these ideas in hypnosis about how suggestion and words can be completely transform somebody's conscious state. And really it's just conversation and language that's doing it.
Absolutely.
And, quite amazing what we can do to communicate among ourselves.
Yeah, and you can even use it for improving your own performance in life. I think probably a lot of athletes, the Los Angeles Lakers were famous for using it many years ago, and it can be useful in life. We all know the power of language to change the way that we feel, and the words that we say to ourselves seem to have some effect on how we feel. And
there's real power in there.
Right.
Cameron Keyes, thanks again, and we'll be back with more tomorrow. So we come to the end of another edition of Consciousness Central. I hope you've enjoyed our offerings for today. Join us again tomorrow for even more consciousness.
Thank you.